we have a really interesting video for you guys today. Kind of out there, but we actually referenced this on Tartaria Part 2 and never really explained it. Before beginning, I just wanted to give a big shout out to Conspiracy RS. We've been mentioning his video on waste management for years, and we just wanted to have a resource here on the channel where we can ask these questions and try to understand what's going on. The reason we're questioning waste management is because throughout the last 300 years, there have been severe issues with how we manage getting rid of mass amounts of human waste. They don't really focus in on this on history class and highlighting how it doesn't really make sense for a people to construct a massive city and then 100 years later realize that their entire sewage system needed to be reconstructed so that they could properly manage getting rid of such a large population's excrement. Just to make clear how important this is, without proper fecal sludge management, it can back up, get in the water, make people sick, and so you would think that people who built these large cities would have known that from the get-go. Why was this something that had to be rediscovered or reinvented after people started getting sick and it becoming a problem? This will be explained more as we proceed, but for now, let's just start with some well-known examples of horrible waste management. The Great Stink of London. In 1858, the River Thames got so backed up with human waste that disease started to spread, prompting action from the government. There are several illustrations of this, and supposedly thousands of people died from cholera. I wouldn't be surprised if it was even more when you consider other outbreaks and faulty statistics. The final number they tell us is 20,000 people died due to the Great Stink. Quote, the scientist Michael Faraday described the situation in a letter to the Times in July 1855. Shocked at the state of the Thames, he dropped pieces of white paper into the river to test the degree of opacity. His conclusion was, near the bridges, the feculence rolled up in clouds so dense they were visible at the surface, even in water of this kind. The smell was very bad and common to the whole of the water. It was the same as that which now comes up from the gully holes in the streets. The whole river was for the time a real sewer. The smell of the river was so bad that in 1857, the government poured chalk lime, chloride of lime, and carbolic acid into the river to ease the stench. It seems that the main problem was that during this time, they had begun installing public flush toilets, and so people were beginning to get these in their households for the first time. According to the official history, the first public toilets were not invented until the 1850s, where they were showcased in the Great Exhibition of 1851 in London. In many of these events of such horrible waste management, such as with the Great Stink, they want to blame it on hot weather, but no, it has nothing to do with mass amounts of people flooding their waste into pipes that are designed only for rainwater. So it seems that London, from all the history that we know, has never had a good relationship with waste management, as people suspect that it had a role in the plague that wiped out a quarter of the population in just 18 months in 1665. So it took until the 19th century for them to start looking into ways of proper waste management. It's interesting that some of these earliest sewers were made of brick, and I wonder if this is something that was lost or forgotten, but just consider this for later. The city of London had over 200,000 cesspits that leaked methane gas, which usually caught fire and or exploded. So just keep that in mind. But before we look into other examples, let's take a look at how this worked in America. So colonial America used wastewater management, where they would literally get rid of the waste and water together, either through dumping it into the yard, street, gutter, or an open channel serving as a sewer. The story goes, this is just how they dealt with things until the 1850s. The majority of people just accepted the sanitation problems as a necessary part of urban life. But it wasn't until major epidemics began happening that they decided to start inventing sewage systems. So let me get this straight. This is what Chicago looked like in 1860, and we're supposed to believe that they had this entire city built out, and they waited 100 years to even think of proper waste management? It's as if large amounts of humans having to empty their bowels never so much as crossed their minds. There's a theme that they blame this all on the Asiatic cholera that had been spreading in other cities around the world at this time, without pointing out what the real cause of the issue was: human waste. Chicago had no sewers. What do you mean Asiatic outbreak? they were dumping their waste on the streets and the Chicago River, and why wouldn't people start to get sick? So all their waste was going to Lake Michigan, which multiple cities were getting their water from, and so this brought deadly contaminants and disease essentially into every household. And this was not just in Chicago, this was everywhere in the States. We only know about Chicago and the New York events because those were obviously the biggest ones, but this happened all over the world during this time. Because of these outbreaks, the hero or the person responsible with creating the first comprehensive sewer system in the United States was Ellis Chesbrough. This is the engineer that basically fixed all the waste management issues in the United States with this new system that divided floodwater and waste into different systems and redirected it into the Mississippi River. That's the thing that you'll see with all these stories, is that they never even really fix it. It's just that they redirect it to some other area that probably causes issues in other small towns. Also, Chicago was flooded during this point, which was another reason they needed waste management. So it wasn't just swamp water, with the whole story that they had to rise the entire city by 15 feet. It was fecal sludge. I just find it hard to believe, especially a city with the World Fair and all these extravagant buildings. How do you mess up that bad when creating a city? It seems that this is a time after the reset that these cities began to become backed up from their new inhabitants being unable to discover the proper method of waste management. You have to consider, why wouldn't this be one of the first things planned for when starting a city? You could probably make the argument that millions have died from waste management from the 1600s to the modern day, from disease outbreaks to unclean water, to even the famous Black Plague being caused by unsanitary habits. If this is the case, then why wouldn't the masterminds who constructed these cities, many in Europe being constructed entirely on star forts with sacred geometrical designs, why is it that they had no concept of waste management? Could it be that these cities were not designed by who we were taught, and actually they were found after some type of reset? After being repopulated, these inhabitants had to rediscover how to grow food, reverse engineer leftover inventions, and they also needed to accommodate for their different ways of living. It could very well be that most of the inhabitants of these cities were orphans, and a ruling class raised them as the working class, taught them everything they needed to know, and didn't care one way or another if they were living in filth. I wouldn't be surprised if the elite class doled out technology to them to give the illusion of natural progress, despite the obvious signs of advanced civilizations all around them. I say that because there is a reason that these cities were not designed with sewers. It's because that's not the most efficient method, and/or it was never needed. This brings to mind the fact that in the mainstream timeline, the ancient Romans and Greeks had better waste management than we did in the 1800s. It was very advanced actually, and the Romans were known to be very hygienic. Now, if you followed our other stuff when we've brought up the Etruscans before and the early Greeks being involved with the Druids, well, mainstream history tells us that the first sewers in Rome were built by these Etruscans. Now, we don't know if these first ones were used for waste. It could be that they were more for redirecting rainwater, as it may wash away the topsoil, so that seems to be a good explanation of what the original builders would want in their cities, a method for redirecting water in an efficient manner for all sorts of means. If this is true, then the Romans had advanced aqueducts that we can't even replicate today. These would deliver fresh water around the city, and there are even engravings showing this process. I remember seeing one picture that showed there was this device above this small little home showing that there may have been electricity involved in this process. Another thing to consider is Cloaca Maxima, which again, I do not think was originally intended for waste. I mean, look how massive this is. For water management, I can understand, but it seems that it wasn't until later times that the aqueducts were then connected to the Cloaca Maxima and it still became unusable because of the growing population. It is said that the Cloaca Maxima is the first major sewer system, and it was built by the 3 Etruscan kings, which, I don't know, that sounds very interesting. It was so big that it was large enough for wagons loaded with hay to pass, and that it could transport 1 million pounds of waste, water, and unwanted goods. It seems that it wasn't until later that they began creating latrines of all sorts and sizes. Now, a latrine is an outhouse, but it can be anything that basically lets you poop into a hole. But what is it really? It's a waste collector. Does this really make sense? Okay, so these advanced Roman architects are going to build these fancy outhomes for pooping into these holes. It would be very difficult to clean and get out, and or you would have to constantly keep rebuilding new ones once they filled up. I just don't think this makes too much sense. But what if there's a component that we're missing? Think about it. These are called latrines, or it seems to be very close to lantern, something that you can ignite. These are very interesting, and they had them all over the ancient world. But what if they weren't just ancient outhouses? Now, I think there are multiple things going on here. These could have been made in a later time by new populations after the reset, and or this was a method that people who originally built these structures used in the process of getting rid of their waste. The reason I phrase it that way is because I do believe there are two things going on. The first being, and I'm not sure the best way to ask this, but did ancient advanced civilizations really poop? Now that sounds crazy, and yes, there's more to explain as many of these old world buildings and mansions from around the world actually do not contain bathrooms. I do believe that this is a possible explanation, and in our ancient past, we did not need to eat in the same way that we do now. The other explanation that many may find more plausible is that there was some type of ancient technology for efficiently converting poop into electricity. And no, I don't think that sounds crazy, as this is what is happening today. From the BBC, dog poo powers Malvern Hills street lamps. Quote, dog walkers on the Malvern Hills are being encouraged to drop the waste into an anaerobic digester which converts it into methane to fuel the lamp. From The Guardian, Thames Water turns to poo power for renewable electricity generation. Quote, the company estimates that 16% of its electricity needs will be met in the current financial year by burning sewage flakes. From The Washington Post, quote, burning humanity's poop could yield up to 9.5 billion. I could keep going, there are many of these articles, but just type in poop fuel and you'll get your answer. Not only is it possible, they're doing it right now.
Flowers are blooming in an unconventional spot.
Right here we have a vertical hydroponic wall, which is basically making use of the nutrients and water recovered from the wastewater that our system is treating.
This mini sewage system, called a new generator, was developed by University of South Florida engineering professor Daniel Ye and his research team. NEW stands for nutrients, energy, and water, which the generator recovers from human waste.
This system works well. It allows us to sort of get rid of our waste and actually recover clean water from that.
And harness energy.
Think of this as a renewable natural gas that's sitting in our waste, and we're, for the most part, not mining that. So we're able to mine that, and then you can burn that for energy, for heating water, for cooking, generate electricity, a number of uses.
Solar panels provide enough to keep everything running. Even in a power outage, they can supply enough power to keep the system running till maintenance can come and restore power.
And it's not just flowers that could grow from a system like this.
People could potentially grow their own food, lettuce crops, any vegetative crops. Can get you a multimeter.
Professor Ye received a grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to develop this in hopes of alleviating some of the problems worldwide with water and sanitation.
If you think about a community that doesn't have sanitation, that doesn't have clean water, is lacking energy, this unit addresses many of those day-to-day concerns.
They had success during a test in India. The unit was connected to electronic toilets, handling up to 100 users a day.
What we're hoping to do next is to provide the service to the schools in South Africa, maybe put the system in some of the refugee camps around the world that's struggling with some of these same issues.
So, we know that yes, poop can be turned into energy. Before continuing down that thought train, let's explore some examples of architecture that you would think would be constructed with bathrooms or some type of plumbing system, yet they tell us that the first plumbing systems didn't really come into play until 1850. 1850? That seems pretty late to just be figuring out plumbing, yet you're building massive cities all around the United States? This wasn't new. These people knew uncleanliness led to disease. This has been happening for aeons. It's instinct at this point. If everyone was so sick and weak, then how the hell did they build these cities? The excuse is that it's only after these cities started thriving that disease came. Yet in Europe, we see the same thing around the 1850s with this cholera epidemic. So no, there's no excuse. London and France had plenty of time in developing a plumbing system. In fact, this technology was apparently there in the early 1600s, and that's in mainstream history. The Palace of Versailles is said to have been built in 1623, first beginning from a hunting lodge, and they have this whole story too, that Louis XIII was into hunting and he was not fit to be a king or something about this place being in a wooded wetland, which is kind of interesting. But There were also many cases of smallpox at this time, which, yes, I believe has to do with the filth and not some imaginary V word. This palace is incredible for this time period it is said to be built. Not only do the early engravings show that it was built on a star fort, but this looks like some type of self-contained city. Kind of like the asylums in America, but mixed in with fancy mansions, possibly some type of government building from some prior age. I'll explain more on that shortly when we talk about the Gilded Age. But the weird thing about this place, well, I mean, there are a bunch of weird things, but there are no bathrooms. I mean, look at how huge this place is. Why is it that with all these massive mansions, essentially, based on the story that they give us, so they built this place and then Louis XIII dies and they just left this place deserted for 10 years? There was also some type of corruption going on, as it seems Louis XIII had bad monetary practices, whatever that means. There was even a supposed battle over this original chateau, some type of intense prince battle. They're telling you that different parties were fighting over the ownership. But yeah, this place had over 2,300 rooms, but not one bathroom. It's also weird how the people of France absolutely hated this place because think about what the mainline story is saying. These were rich aristocrats essentially just blowing their money without a care in the world, while the rest of the population just got the scraps. Now, I'm sure that did actually happen, but why is it that the story every time with these palaces and mansions is the same thing? Just seems strange. I was looking at some of these rooms too, like the king's bedchamber and the queen's apartment and all, and I just don't believe people actually lived here. Just highly doubt it. And look at all this gold. That's one of the things about Versailles. It has an insane amount of gold, unlike any palace for this time. Where did they get all this gold? I'm gonna keep going, but I thought this was interesting as well. Between 1925 and 1928, American philanthropist John D. Rockefeller gave $2.1 million, or $30 million today, to refurbish the palace. Wait, what? And nothing weird is supposed to be going on here? Again, same theme. Wealthy philanthropists getting involved. To drive my point home, basically, there are a bunch of weird things about this palace and its history that does not line up, but not only did it not have bathrooms, which makes zero sense if this was where all the aristocrats were living with rooms completely gilded in gold, not only did they 100% have the money to afford building bathrooms, they had the technology. The first and most important part about this whole palace was the gardens. For some reason, this was so important to them. Not only did they need gilded mansions, they needed the most amazing fountains for its time. So amazing that new technology needed to be invented to facilitate this process. Forget about inventing a plumbing system or better waste management so that we can all start to get rid of disease that's been plaguing our civilization. No, let's not do that. Let's spend all this effort making massive artistic fountains. Okay, so we know they spent a bunch of money building this palace with all this gold and stuff. Not only did Louis XIV somehow get all this money to expand his father's chateau, but he also hired engineers Arnold de Ville and Renquin Solem to just build this machine de Marly, which they say took $30 million to build, and they did it in 4 years. This was a massive advanced hydraulic system designed to pump water from the Seine up a steep elevation to an aqueduct so that it could be used in the Palace of Versailles. They did this, all of this, just for the fountains. But they didn't think to use the technology to get rid of the waste. Before this machine was built, they were literally taking all the water supply from Paris just to supply these fountains. They realized they needed more, so they built this machine, pumped around 850,000 gallons of water, and ironically, it still wasn't enough as they needed 4 times the amount of water. This machine de Marly is pretty insane too. It had 14 gigantic wheels and 250 pumps to bring water uphill 600 feet. Now, I don't necessarily think that this machine is ancient tech. I think it was something designed to try to figure out how to work with the architecture and technology that was already there, like the fountains, but over time, the machine just started to fail and there wasn't enough water, so I'm not sure if this was really the original source. But I bring it up because it shows that the technology was there at this time. So why Why, if they already had so much experience with civil engineering, they understood that sickness came from filth, the tech was there, they had the money to spend, then why were there so many issues with waste management? Why were there no bathrooms in this marvelous place? You know what they tell us in mainstream history? They were just dirty. These aristocrats would relieve themselves in the hallways or stairwells. I'm reading this article and it's saying that no one bothered to house train the royal dogs and servants wouldn't even consider cleaning it up. Does that sound right to you? Because for one moment, let's just forget about whether this palace was capable of being built during this time period, which possibly, but not by these people. You're saying they spent all this money to build this palace and just gleefully shat all over the place? Come on. It gets even worse. So I have to be real careful here. So I don't recommend looking this up, but I think it's crucial to understanding my point. There's this famous French artist from this very time period, and he wasn't just an artist, he was a nobleman, a revolutionary politician, but he's known because he drew these erotic, almost BDSM type engravings of these aristocrats basically experimenting with sex in the most foul, extreme way possible. I mean, I'm being moderate with my descriptions, I kid you not. I literally can't even show them in this video. Just type in Marquis de Sade or Marquise de Sade. I can't even believe that this exists, and people think that these are the same people who built these structures, but it's almost as if they're just discovering that they have buttholes. Not only that, there's an engraving with these women having an orgy with a goat. It's extremely graphic, so please forgive me, I can't really show it, but yes, it is on Google Images. So anyways, yeah, these fountains were amazing. You know, it's also weird that they call Louis XIV the Sun King. But yeah, he needed to have these amazing fountains with all this deep symbolism ingrained. He was a man of science, yet they were cool with just going to the bathroom right in the halls. To move on, this is not the only instance of these palaces having no bathrooms. Buckingham Palace is said to have 78 bathrooms if you look this up, but they won't tell you that this wasn't originally the case. These were added later. I mean, there are 775 rooms. If you have that many people, you need more bathrooms. Not only that, but those are for staff and royalty, but visitors don't have access to a single toilet in the palace. You really have to think about this. These palaces are conceptualized by and for these wealthy aristocrats, and I mean, you're going to be having thousands of people in here supposedly eating very extravagant food every single day. They didn't consider where the food ended. Think about how much waste that is, how disgusting these palaces were during this period, and that's not me saying that, that's mainstream history. They say it's just because it was just a dark age. I mean, many of these palaces were being created during the Renaissance period, the age of enlightenment, the age of invention, science, yet they couldn't figure out bathrooms, and they were cool with it. People were getting sick and they weren't smart enough to figure out that maybe it had something to do with poop. I could keep going and showing you multiple examples of palaces like this, but to sum it up, if you look at these palaces from around the 16th to 18th centuries, they have this weird theme of being overly extravagant, spiritually and symbolically aligned, yet they don't have proper waste management, and the elite that mainstream history tells us built these buildings were okay with just allowing their occupants to poop all over their beautiful creation. Or maybe there's something else going on. Now before we get to that, this brings us to the Gilded Age, because it's not just with these European palaces in from the 19th and early 20th century. We have another strange theme that pops up in America. You have all these rich mansions or palaces being built that look very similar to the palaces in Europe. They're all a part of this Gilded Age, or really another piece of propaganda that was sold to us from historical writers like Mark Twain, under the guise of fighting against corruption. Or was it just another Marxist attempt to persuade the populace into accepting their new overlords? Real quick to explain that, Mark Twain was a fake. First off, his real name was Samuel Longhorn Clemens, and he was a slaveholder. So he grew his way to riches, probably because of his family, right? He was literally a symbol of the American dream. Then out of nowhere, towards the end of his life, he becomes this huge critic of these capitalists, as if he wasn't one of them. Anyways, yes, basically, these wealthy capitalists, the robber barons, And I know they say that because they're stealing wealth, but I don't think that's the only thing they stole. So yeah, we're talking Rockefellers, Carnegie, JP Morgan, Henry Ford, Vanderbilts, and many other families that most of them were not even American. They were plants and connected with secret societies in Europe. Not only that, but they were connected to famous writers as well, such as H.G. Wells and the Fabian Society. They created our entire worldview. They wanted us to see them as wealthy capitalists because that was really a lie. That was crony capitalism. They were plants. They were hijackers. And how, if you look into this whole Gilded Age and robber baron fiasco, you see that they all started spending a bunch of money on these enormous mansions, some of which have never really been replicated today. These buildings contain these amazing, expensive artworks, and I know these people were rich, but where did they get all this money from? There's also evidence to support that many of these old buildings had some type of special tech that was lost. The fireplaces in these buildings do not seem to be for burning wood, being as extravagant as they are. There are always these strange devices that are seen in these older fireplaces from this Gilded Age time period. Were these some type of heating system that came with the original building, and so after being repurposed, they began burning wood and just ruining these places? Now, it's not to say that some of these buildings may have been truly built at this time. Even though these building techniques are ancient, in some cases it is fully possible with the right resources to construct some of these buildings. But in the large majority of the cases, many aspects of the story do not line up, and these buildings may not be ancient, but it's possible that they were not built in the fashion that we have been told. I think it's odd that so many of these photos had vanilla skies and that compositing and photo manipulation was actually a crucial part of the process. It was just called photo retouching back then. But you don't think they can do this with architecture? Absolutely. And if we consider what we know about the history of waste management in these robber barons, it's very possible that there was some sort of hijacking that took place. In the official narrative, it even tells us that these European palaces had multiple battles taking place over the ownership of the buildings. How do we know that the winners didn't just make up some history? Well, one good example, and there are several that would each make their own good videos, but many of these buildings were demolished, and there were several of these on the famous 5th Avenue, the Vanderbilt mansions. I bring this up because not only is this very European looking, but the amount of art and wealth put into this place is insane. It was a massive French Renaissance palace called Petit Chateau. Interesting. The Vanderbilts had hundreds of properties. I really don't buy the official narrative at all. When you look at 5th Avenue, right? This is also where St. Patrick's Cathedral is. If you're one of those, but they're construction photos people. Yeah, I know. There isn't that much though. The spires weren't added until 1930. Whenever you see these posed construction photos, you know something's up. Who knows? But it's very odd, and I'm sure they could add on and build on top of these structures, but it's always the same thing of showing it once it's already been constructed. Why aren't these photos better preserved if these people were so wealthy? I'm talking insane wealthy. The Vanderbilts were far richer than anyone today. William received almost $100 million, or I think $3 billion, but the difference is no one back then had anything near this amount of wealth except royalty in other countries, which again is why the history regarding these families are so suspect. There's actually a lot to this Vanderbilt story that may be outside the scope of this one video, but this is a good foreshadowing to our next video that I promise you, I think you guys will really enjoy. We're going to go visit the biggest one, that's all I'll say. But back to what I was saying about the different possibilities as to what's going on here with waste management. I do believe it's a little bit of both scenarios. There must have been a time in our development where we did not need to poop. Now, of course, this is coming from a spiritual, cosmological view, not the modern view of evolution that says our consciousness formed after matter. No, this idea that we came from spirit and slowly became material or devolved over time. We first became harmonious with nature, the first stage, or the Fae people, the androgynous spirit beings, the blue beings that were in harmony with forest. Of course, I'm talking before Atlantis and very early astral human stages of development. But over time, after the deluge, it would make sense that things were more material, and so humans began to eat and poop. At first, being that after the deluge, The main people building these architectures were the Druids, Aryans, or the teachers after Atlantis, which yes, included all varieties of people. They began building these architectures, but they possessed some technology for converting their poop into an energy source, keeping their cities clean, and this would also give them a good renewable resource. This is the intelligence I would expect from the minds behind these palaces. All it would take is these latrines or lanterns that can collect a vast amount of fecal matter and then convert the methane or gas into a fuel source. Don't think it's that advanced of a tech, and this would be another fuel source that they would have access to. Maybe this is what they did for a while, possibly then learning about aether technology and atmospheric electricity, which then could have been another factor involving the cataclysms occurring during this time. After the cataclysms, people began moving into these cities, as in with Europe. They started to reverse engineer these leftover cities, but the only difference is that because of these cataclysms, these survivors that found these cities were of a different culture and had resulted in eating flesh and were cannibals. This is the true history of meat eating. It began with cannibalism, not the need for hunting. If you are that primitive that you have to survive off the hunt, then what happens when there's nothing to hunt? Most tribes resorted to cannibalism. So, this concept of eating flesh got introduced into these cities. You had these people literally farming thousands of animals. They moved in a populace of people or orphans into these cities, and the aristocrats would just sit on top while they shat in these hijacked palaces from a recent civilization. They then tainted not only the entire city with fecal matter, but then they destroyed the water source. It really makes no sense if you think about it. It's literally impossible to create a functioning society in the way that they tell us without proper hygiene. Yet, they were just living this way for the last 2,000 years, but the Romans had it figured out. That makes sense. Not only that, but toxic poop became problematic in other ways. They began taking this toxic poop that not only was causing cholera everywhere, but they would take this sewage sludge from the cities and create these sewage farms for using these poops to fertilize the population's food supply. You don't think that has an energetic effect on the foods that we eat? If you bring in all that we said about the United States, none of these cities were designed with plumbing or waste management in mind. They had to reinvent it after the 1850s, which just shows that they had no clue what they were doing. I don't see the sudden rise in city population being an appropriate argument, as the level of architecture, science, and tech being developed at this time does not align with their inability to properly design and set up these cities. It actually makes more sense that these cities were founded upon older foundations, and slowly, piece by piece, they made modifications. If you've seen Tartaria Explained on underground cities, almost every American city has an entire underground component or old city beneath the modern one. Just like Futurama, the next civilization builds on top of the old. I think it's not too crazy to think that there would be some sort of cultural amnesia that goes over along with something like a cataclysm, especially if there are more children than adults left over. So you tell me, what do you think? Was there a time where humans didn't have to poop? Why do these palaces not have bathrooms, and why were these aristocrats pooping in the hallways? Was there possibly a way that they could use poop as a fuel source? Hope you guys are having a good week, and if you guys could come hang out with us in the Discord, it would be super cool. We sometimes do movie nights, and it's honestly a great resource for collecting ideas and just staying connected. It's okay if you don't know anything about Discord, just download it, send me a message, and I will literally explain everything. But yeah, you can do everything from your phone or browser. Just come into the server, ask us questions directly. It's the easiest way to get in contact with us and to assist in growing the community. Sending you guys a bunch of love, and all we can hope is that our minds may be unveiled.
Let go of everything you think to be true. Relax the mind and ask the question, do I truly understand what this reality is?